Welcome back to LIS570. This week we're going to be talking about qualitative data analysis. This is building on what we talked about last week in terms of a set of methods that we can use to both design instruments and then use those instruments to collect some data. Now, the data that we're ultimately going to produce are going to look rather similar across the three methods. Interviews, document and content analysis, as well as participant observation all produce textual data. And so we're going to talk today about how we go about coding that textual data such that we can make sense of it and use it for the purpose of answering our research questions. All right, so let's jump in. All right, so in the introduction, I said that we had data collected through qualitative means that oftentimes take a textual form. Now, this is for the purpose of, or this is for the reason that we're oftentimes engaged with participants or engaged with objects produced by our participants that take a tangible form through some language, right? So if we're conducting an interview, we record that interview, and ultimately what we produce is something like a textual transcript. If we're collecting documents or even objects, images, videos of some sort, ultimately what we're going to have is some sort of language-based description of those videos. And if we are out doing participant observation, ultimately what we're producing from those observations are sets of memos which help us reflexively understand and interpret what we're viewing. But the broad point that I'm making here is that ultimately what we're going to come down to having is a set of language-based descriptions that take a form of text that we need to find a way to make some sense out of. And so let's think about how we might do that through an inductive lens. Well, the first thing that we might do is to start to, as induction tells us, move from the particular to the general. And we're going to start to try to do that by trying to lump together, that is, combine some of the things that we've seen into a pattern, which we can name. And by naming that pattern, we can come up with some explanation of how individual actions, which lead to some high-level pattern, has an explanation. And when we're going to do this in a textual way, we're oftentimes going to start to code our data. That is, we're going to apply names to the patterns that we're seeing as a set of codes. So as our slides say here, another way to describe what we're doing is that we're trying to produce a finding. That is, we're trying to come to a generalization. Now, I think for the savvy amongst you, you'll start to say, let me move my camera up here a bit. You'll start to say, look, you're acting, Professor Weber, like a post-positivist. You're trying to turn what is the rich, meaningful description of a scenario or some event that happens between me and my interview participant into some sort of number or some sort of code. And you're right. In some ways, that's the way that I think about and I make meaning of the world through my paradigm. But this is an important distinction that we need to consider at the analysis phase, is that when we begin to generalize from particulars to some form of pattern or some sort of coding, what we're doing is coming to some justification about how our beliefs have been arrived at, right? So if we, say, are more in line with a post-positivist and we think that truth exists, then largely what we're doing is looking for evidence, looking for evidence that supports the hypotheses or the beliefs that we already have. That is, we're testing something, and we're saying whether or not there's a match between what we've tested or what we found. Now, if we're moving or working from the kind of more constructivist, inductive standpoint, what we're doing is we're not looking necessarily for the truth, right? We're looking to construct and make meaning of a set of particulars that we already have. So for qualitative data, we can take both deductive and inductive approaches to the coding, but oftentimes it seems a little strange to take deductive approaches to qualitative data that's been collected for the simple reason of we've been a substantive part of its creation. And I'll talk about this in just a couple seconds, but I want to seed that for a little bit later in the lecture. All right, so to sum up real quick, let's kind of take a step back about where we've just come from in terms of data collection. We're looking to justify the beliefs that we hold about the data that we've collected. And we're going to do this by trying to generalize about what we believe that we have found. In order to do this, we're going to start by turning our text into generalizations. That is, the specifics of what someone said, we're going to try to move towards themes or patterns that we can more easily identify and explain. All right, so let's move forward then in thinking about or unpacking sort of this idea of codes and coding and what this process looks like in the qualitative tradition. So by codes, a qualitative scholar means a way in which we can note a theme that appears in our data. Theme here we can also think of as a set of patterns. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to apply codes, the process of coding, by going through passages of the text or the data that we've collected. Now, the codes and the coding that's done is oftentimes driven by or documented by what's called a code book. And in that code book, we're going to have examples of a code, we're going to have definitions of a code, and we're going to have ways in which that code may either apply or vary or have some sort of aberration that we shouldn't pay attention to. We'll look at a couple of examples of these in just a second. But I want to underscore the idea of when a code book comes into existence based on if we're acting inductively or deductively in the analysis of our data. So think about this kind of naturally. If we have a subjective that is a way in which we're approaching our research inductively, then we're going to see the codes take shape first, and then we'll later define them. We'll later make sense of them because we're moving from, right, those concrete particulars to some generalizations. Now, if we're acting deductively, that is, we already have a theory or an explanation in mind, and what we're looking to our textual qualitative data that we've collected as being an explanation which helps either accept or refute the hypothesis or the idea that we have, then we're going to develop the codebook first and then go looking to apply those codes later. So the kind of inductive phase is let the codes, what qualitative scholars would say, emerge, and deductively what we would say is generate the codebook first and apply the codes second. All right, so we're going to talk about three types of codes. The first two that we're going to talk about are going to be descriptive and topic, and the last one that we're going to talk about is going to be around analytic coding. So we can think of descriptive or structural codes as being kind of our first initiation into data, where we're going to describe characteristics about maybe who the data represents. We're going to answer sort of the basic who, what, when, where, how of the data that were collected. Now, in our second pass, that is, we're going to reread maybe the same transcript if it's an interview, or we're going to look at the same set of objects, or we're going to look at the same set of memos. What we're going to try to do is then describe instances or particular examples in some sort of more general way. And that passage can include multiple ways in which we're going to try to orient ourselves to what are the broader questions we're looking to tease out. What did we ask the participant, and how did their explanation or their response match maybe a couple of other participants' explanations and responses? What we're doing in the second passage is we're really moving up a level towards that generalization. So I think this helps make more sense if we actually look at a passage of some qualitative data, and let's try to make sense of it by first applying some descriptive codes and then applying some thematic codes. All right, so here's a quote that we'll analyze. It says, "We think that sometimes as parents we don't talk about violence to our sons. Therefore, when they start to have conflict, they don't have as much knowledge or experience with staying calm or talking through a problem. They say that boys have a higher risk of being kicked out because there's less information out there, less knowledge on how not to hurt somebody when you're mad." Okay, so this quote is coming to us from a father who is 40 years of age. He has 2 kids enrolled at Public School 401, which consists of 4th and 5th graders in New York City. He was interviewed at the PS 401 in 2014 by a set of educational researchers who were doing work trying to understand students who had been expelled or suspended and what that meant in the context of public school parenting. So the question that this particular parent, this father age 40, is responding to is, why do you think there are so many expulsions in PS 401? All right, so if we take a descriptive analysis, then what we're going to do is we're going to sort of think like, all right, this is the context of the identity of the person, the location in which they are talking or speaking about a phenomena like anger or like violence. And we're going to think particularly about the question that was asked of that individual and what they're responding to. So our descriptive analysis at first is just going to try to contextualize what's going on within this particular interview. What exactly is this person responding to? And we may note this in kind of the margins of when we're annotating or when we're coding our data. But so far we haven't really developed any codes yet, right? So the next thing that we might do is come up with some topics or some themes that we want to try to pull out from a passage like this and compare it across, say, other transcripts or other passages where participants who were asked, why do you think there are so many expulsions in PS 401, gave similar answers. All right, so let's think about how we might do that next. So let's say that there's parent-child communication, let's say there's conflict avoidance strategies, and let's say there's risk. Those are 3 topics which we might look for across all of the parents that answered the question of why do you think there's so many expulsions? So with those 3 codes or those 3 themes and topics in mind, we can go back to and actually highlight or note the places where parent-child communication comes in, such as we don't talk about violence to our sons. That's one explanation, right, for why expulsions are so high. Another might be, well, maybe the boys that attend PS 401 don't have conflict avoidance strategies. That is, they haven't been taught or they don't understand how to de-escalate certain situations. Right? So we can go back into the quote from this particular parent and we can say, all right, well, so first he's talking about staying calm and talking through a problem, but then later he comes back to that and says there's less knowledge on how not to hurt someone when you're mad. So we actually have 2 instances within the same kind of passage that have to do with conflict avoidance strategy. Same thing for risk, right? We can identify where in the particular passage or the response to this particular question, we can identify something with risk. And what we would do as qualitative scholars is we would continue to return to the thematic coding of transcripts where we're maybe looking across the entire transcript of one participant for parent-child communication codes. And then we're going to the next participant looking for parent-child communication codes. Or what we might do is look at that particular question across all of the participants. So if we had 10 participants, we'd line up all 10 transcripts and we'd look just across all 10 of those, looking for responses to this particular question and whether there was parent-child communication, conflict avoidance, or risk that was noted within the responses to that particular question. You can see here the way in which we're taking a topic or a theme like risk and we're looking for particular examples to apply that within our particular responses from participants. Now, the way that we went about doing this and just talking through it is that we had some codes and we then applied those codes knowing what we thought they should explain. This is to act somewhat deductively. If we were to go about this inductively, right, we would first return to kind of our blank descriptive analysis and we'd start to think, well, what are the topics or what are the ideas that this person's talking about? And maybe we'd come up with risk, but maybe we'd come up with something different. Like maybe we'd come up with the violence that happens, say, in a home, or the violence that these boys have been exposed to in, say, different media, right? There's all kinds of ways in which we could come up with a set of topics and then start to apply those topics. In this sense, we could imagine the codes emerging naturally from our reading, our rereading, and our reflection on the response to this particular question. But whether we're arriving at these inductively or deductively, we still have a transcript that looks relatively similar, right? We have examples of the parent-child communication, the conflict avoidance, and the risk. The 3 topics that we've identified here, all noted and annotated within our transcript. All right, so at this point, let me put a small plug in for the coding exercise that exists in this week's lecture page. So essentially what you have is a handout, which is a free response questionnaire from a survey of 500 different K through 12 educators. So the survey was distributed in 2010 at an educational conference in Bloomington, Indiana. And the responses that you'll see are educators that are answering the question, what major factor led you into teaching? Okay, so all 500 responses are going to be to this specific question. So here's the challenge to you. Read through the responses. You don't have to read all 500, but there are 3 to 4 sentences, sometimes 1 or 2 sentences. Try to develop 5 codes that categorize the factors that a person led to them pursuing teaching, right? That is 5 explanations of what pushed them into teaching. And once you have those 5, give them a definition. So one of your definitions one of your codes may be lifelong learning. And so your definition for lifelong learning would be something like the person just really loved school and wanted to continue to be a part of it. And we can imagine going through those 500 different responses and coding all of the ones that were in line with lifelong learning. So this is, I think, a nice way to start to see what is a set of canned examples, but real examples that we can start to develop some skills around thematic coding and definitions. All right, so this far we've talked about descriptive and we've talked about thematic coding. Now, let's move forward to analytic coding. So analytic coding is going to be kind of our third or our last pass, where we're going to go through the codes that we already have and we're going to try to either combine them or split them so that we arrive at a final code book and a final set of topics or analysis which helps us answer our research questions. Now, there's kind of 2 main activities that typically happen at the analytic coding stage, is that we, in revisiting the thematic codes that we've developed, either need to lump codes together. That is, we have a number of codes that are maybe too narrow, and so we need to put those together into something which is more general. Or we have a code which is too broad and it needs to be split into multiple codes. And qualitative scholars, when they're doing this, often refer to this as splitting or lumping. So in code 1, we may be splitting it into code A, code B, code C. In another example for lumping, we may have code 1, 2, and 3, which really are so similar we can combine them all into code A. So let's maybe look at an example of how we might do that based on the themes that we just had in our previous coding. One way that we might lump these is to think about how our participants, when they were describing some reason that maybe explained expulsions in Public School 401, were focusing first on internalized explanations and second on externalized explanations, right? So we could almost divide this by lumping together things like risk or lumping together things like conflict avoidance strategy into internal factors or external factors. This might be a way in which we come to sort of a greater or a deeper understanding of what it means for this parent to come up with an explanation around, say, violence in a particular school. Is this the right answer for, say, our analysis? Well, it depends on us going back and forth and trying to revisit some of the research questions that we're trying to answer and some of the kind of analysis that we've done here so far. We're going to continue to do this until we come up with analysis that helps us answer a question like, how is blame distributed for high expulsion rates? Well, there's blame that's distributed through internal means and there's blame that's distributed through external means. And here are 2 great examples from the same transcript. The generalizations then that we can make about, say, how blame is distributed comes down to our application of these topics or these things across all of the transcripts that we have. Now, again, I'm explaining this mostly through an inductive application of our logic or our reasoning for applying some topic analysis. Let's think a little bit more about what qualitative data analysis looks like when we're doing something that's deductive. So think about deduction as starting with some hypothesis or some theory. And what we're going to do is try to reject or confirm our hypothesis. So we're not moving from particulars to generalizations, we're moving from generalizations to particulars, right? So deductive analysis of qualitative data is somewhat rare because what we're doing is in shaping the research instruments that we use in qualitative, say, interviewing or participant observation, we have an opportunity to intervene. That is, we have an opportunity to help the person explain in particular ways that either maybe matches the way that we understand, maybe it's primed by the way that we think about the world. But oftentimes we have ways in which we've already shaped that data. So this sort of leads to the qualitative analysis approach from a deductive standpoint feeling a bit awkward. It feels like we've already had a hand in the shaping or the building of the data. But deductive analysis of qualitative data can come through when we talk about, for example, open-ended questions on surveys. And so what this might start with is, say, a predefined codebook, and we're going to record instances of maybe a confirmation of when that code is applied or when that code can't be applied. So sometimes when we see descriptive statistics used around the coding of, say, open questions on a survey, you'll hear something like a percentage of maybe respondents. So if we go back to the example we have, we may say 54% of the fathers interviewed for this study believe that there's an internalization of blame for violence that leads to expulsions. Right, this would be a way in which we would take the internalization or the externalization, go through and try to code based on those descriptions that we already knew before we started reading our transcripts, and try to apply that looking for how many instances. That is, we're going to do some numerical sort of evaluation of the times in which maybe we see an occurrence or the times in which a code appears. Regardless of the same approach that we take, whether it's deductive or inductive, a code book is the documentation that really shapes and guides and creates internal validity for the study that we're doing. And so a code book I think of as having at least 4 characteristics. That is, you have a code, a definition, an application, and an example. So for our code, we might have something general, like the code that is going to be internalized, externalized. For the sake of the example here, we'll say parent-child communication. Then we're going to define that code, right? We're going to explain what we mean, and we can do this in just a simple way of explaining it to ourselves. And then the application is going to be some direction for people that are applying this code. So for example here, we'll say, use this code only when a parent explicitly describes communication, right? So anything that's implicit, we're not going to include in our, say, our coding. And we also go on further to say this is not the same as communication between school teacher and parent, right? So we're making some exceptions there. And then oftentimes when I'm doing qualitative coding, I think it's very helpful to have an example. And so if I know that the code is going to appear, or I go through and I look for an appearance, I pull one out and I put it as an example of, say, parent-child communication. This is going to be our documentation. We're going to do this for each code that's going to appear in our study. And sometimes when we need to either lump or split, we'll return to this documentation and we'll maybe combine some definitions, we'll combine some applications, or we'll start to split those apart and start to define them more rigidly or more specifically. Okay, so the last topic that we're going to hit on for this lecture is thinking about the way in which we apply codes in groups. So oftentimes it's necessary for either internal validation or for simply distributing the amount of work and the time that it takes to inductively code transcripts or do content analysis or do participant observation analysis across a number of people that have been involved in the research. So this is done somewhat to maybe speed data collection, but for another reason is to triangulate data analysis. We have some subjectivity because we're coming up with the codes and we're applying them, but we have a little bit of a claim to objectivity if what we have is maybe my application of a code and maybe Wan Chen's application of the same code to the same transcript, right? There would be some agreement then that that's maybe the right code that should apply to say that particular quote or that particular passage. So some steps for thinking about or approaching group coding is oftentimes to pick one particular transcript, read through it, and code it together as a group. So we all sit down, we all read one line by line, and we say which code we think maybe should appear. We say maybe what we think a code should be defined as. We come up with maybe alternative definitions. And when we're done, then we're going to take a second transcript, we're going to code it or do the same process, coming up with definitions, coming up with, say, new, maybe alternative explanations and new codes. We're going to do that separately with our second transcript, and then we're going to all come back together and compare. So that process of first working through a set of codes together, then working on the same transcript but separately, leads us to some sort of deeper understanding about the codes that we're trying to generate. If we all want to check on our agreements, we then begin to approach something called inter-rater reliability. So let me say a quick word about this. Typically, it's the idea that we have a measurement which tells us how likely two raters are to apply the same code, that is a discrete judgment, to the same example. So if we both look at, for example, this quote, how many people in our research group are going to identify the first half of the sentence as internalized, and how many are going to interpret the second half as being about externalized? Well, hopefully we have some amount of agreement. And so IRR, or inter-rater reliability, is going to be an internal validity check. It's going to help us maybe base some of our assumptions about early coding on some measurements. And it's going to help us understand when we either have new team members or existing team members, how well we sort of assess or agree with one another. But the other major thing that inter-rater reliability facilitates is it allows us to take kind of a quantitative measure which can give us the ability to understand we're all working towards, or we're all understanding these codes in the same way so that we can distribute work. Because it takes a long time to go through and code maybe 2, 3, 4 times a particular transcript. If we can divvy that work out across maybe 3 different people that all don't have to look at the same transcript but can code individually transcripts because we have a code book that we agree on, then it allows us to work somewhat reliably more quickly. Okay, so one of the questions then that we might practically ask is, well, then how do we calculate an IRR? What's it based on? So typically we take something like a single transcript, or maybe even a set of single quotes. We all individually code those quotes, and then we compare based on what is the right or wrong application of those codes. So this requires us to compare, say, 2 raters together of how well did they rate, say, maybe our example up here, how many times did they rate internalized versus externalized. Okay, so when we have those measurements across, say, maybe 3 or 4 examples, if we were dealing with 2 raters, we come up with something called Cohn's kappa. This is a coefficient measurement. Or we come up with Fleiss's kappa, which is for 2 or more coders. I'm not going to take the time to explain kind of the math behind them, but there's a number of online tools that you can use to do these calculations for you simply by uploading your examples. I encourage you to look around, or just check to search for them on Google. You can find them. They're quite valuable to use when you have a group of 2 or 3. Let's do a quick sum up then to end the lecture for this week. So qualitative analysis is beginning by organizing data and is either going to move from concrete particulars to generalizations or generalizations to concrete particulars. But regardless of sort of how we orient ourselves around this idea of truth or reality, we have the goal of trying to make meaning by applying a set of common codes to the data. And we can do that in descriptive, thematic, or analytic ways. And these three approaches to our coding then are going to typically be done inductively, but can be approached deductively as well. The difference that separates these is how we begin, either by looking for the codes to emerge or by taking a code book and applying it and providing descriptive statistics from it. Okay, so this has been kind of a crash course on the idea of coding. We'll talk more about this in lecture in the coming week. If you have questions, always feel free to get in touch.